Good morning. I would like to start first by thanking the Asia Pacific Multilingual Education Working Group and the UNESCO for organizing such a diverse and inspiring event. I am truly honored and privileged to be part of this conference and present today on multilingual education in emergency and crisis. There is an alarming increase in the number of people affected by armed conflict, forced displacement, and climate-induced disasters. As a result, millions of children are being robbed of an education. What would a child like the one in the picture in front of you say about his experience in an emergency? A boy like this one would say that because of war, his home and school were destroyed. He was separated from his family. He moved to another country. He had nightmares and trouble sleeping. He had no friends to share his troubles with. He may have joined a temporary learning space, but he couldn't understand the teacher's language and reading materials. And he wasn't sure he will continue to attend this temporary learning space. So in emergencies, children face huge barriers to education, including being taught in languages they do not understand. Yet multilingual education is rarely integrated in education responses. So to transform education and build resilient future, language barriers must also be addressed in education emergency and protracted crisis. So today, we will discuss the intersecting threat of crises like the COVID-19, conflict, climate changes, and how they've increased the need for education in emergency. But first, we will explain what we mean by education in emergency. In the second part of this presentation, we will analyze how language dimension apply in education in emergency and intersect with the learning and well-being of crisis-affected children. And finally, in the third part, I hope we can discuss the way forward and the need for a paradigm shift. In emergency settings, linguistic diversity is unfortunately primarily seen as a barrier to education. However, as we know and we've discussed here in this conference, multilingualism should also be leveraged as a resource, in particular for learning continuity in crisis. The Education Cannot Wait, the first fund for education in emergency, has recently analyzed that 224 million children education has been disrupted by conflict, climate change, and other disasters. While 127 million crisis-affected children are in school, only 57% of them are achieving proficiency level in literacy and math. 72 million school-aged children are out of school in crisis-affected regions. Half of these out-of-school children live in just 8 countries, including 3 countries in Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Myanmar. And Save the Children latest report on refugee education have shown that there are more forcibly displaced people around the world now than at any time in modern history. When we refer to emergency, what are we referring to specifically? I would like to invite you to reflect and ask yourself what type of emergency you can think of. Are these emergencies occurring rapidly or slowly? So you can see here that there are 3 commonly known categories of emergency. The natural hazard, and Asia Pacific region is famous for these, include hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunami, drought, cyclone, floods, landslide, volcanoes, epidemics. We also have human-made hazards, including civil unrest, war, economic blockade, occupation, terrorist attack. But most of the emergency are actually complex emergency, which combine both natural and human-made hazards. And these complex emergency are shown in this diagram in the crossover between natural and human-made hazard. Emergencies are also categorized by their duration. Slow onset events gradually evolve from changes occurring over many years and from an increased frequency or intensity of recurring events. And rapid onset might be a single discrete event that occurs in matters of days or hours. And now I would like to draw your attention to each of the 4 pictures on this slide. Could you ask yourself what sort of impact on education this picture depicts? If you look at the first picture on your right, top right, you can see that this is a school building that was destroyed after a typhoon. The one on the bottom right is a flooded classroom due to extreme rainfalls as a result of climate change. The one on the top left is a classroom with evidence of fire exchange and armed attacks on the school. Finally, the picture with child soldiers show how children in conflict are denied access to education and protection. So emergency do negatively impact education in many ways. And these pictures are really an illustration of physical impact when, school facility may be damaged beyond repair or became unsafe. But there are also less visible impacts like the psychosocial impact. Post-traumatic stress and lack of psychosocial support undermine children's self-confidence. Prolonged school closure results in a lack of social interaction and a sense of isolation. Children may lose a sense of continuity in their identity. And they may also lose a sense of hope and commitment to continue their education. We also know that emergency have negative economic impacts on children's family and caregiver. Parent loss of income can force school-aged children to look after their siblings or to take on new livelihood responsibility. Family affected by several losses may not be able to cover school fees. And finally, there are also learning impacts. The quality of education might be impacted by insufficient supplies of experienced teachers during emergency. You also have overcrowded classrooms when classrooms that are not prepared are hosting displaced children or refugees. And a lack of planning for educational continuity means that valuable instructional time can be lost. And as we know, learning losses will increase as children remain out of school. And the longer the children are out of school, the more likely they are to drop out permanently. And so I'd like to make a bit of a comparison between education emergency and education in development. To reverse this negative impact we've just discussed, we must provide education from the first day of the humanitarian response. The Interagency Network for Education in Emergency defines EIE as a provision of quality education opportunity that meets the physical protection, psychosocial, and cognitive needs of children affected by crisis. As you can see from the comparison displayed on this slide, there is a sense of urgency in responding to the negative impacts of emergency on education. And this provision needs to happen immediately, as education cannot wait. Another big differentiator is that in emergency, education is protection. And education response need to integrate mental health and psychosocial support, as well as social and emotional learning. While we place humanitarian and development side by side, this is somehow a simplification, and I'd like to draw now your attention to this conceptual framework for phases of emergency. For holistic child development, quality learning opportunities need to be sustained over time. And there is a continuum between emergencies and development. It's, as you may know, commonly called the humanitarian development nexus. This slide represents this humanitarian development continuum with different emergency phases. So before the trigger, represented in this red dotted vertical line, you have what we call the preparedness and mitigation phase. This is where we plan and organize to mitigate, prevent, anticipate, protect against, and respond to disasters and conflict. From 1 week to 6 weeks after the emergency trigger, what we call the acute response phase, this is where we have to address the immediate education need of children and families. From 6 months to 18 months, it's the early recovery phase, when we transition from immediate needs to more long-term needs. And finally, from 18 months onward, shown in green here, we transition to longer-term development, and we connect back to mitigation, prevention, and preparedness. So it is a cycle. This is during the last phase that we must build and strengthen the resilience of education system. And so what does it mean for education? Well, as we have discussed, education needs to focus on the actual needs of the affected children, but these needs will vary depending on the emergency phases we've just discussed. The education response, the acute phase, will have to provide immediately recreational and learning materials, set up temporary learning space when school buildings have been damaged, as we've seen. And this obviously needs to happen in collaboration with education authorities and communities. We have in this first phase to support as well teachers' well-being, because they may have been affected themselves, and to provide training in partnership with the Ministry of Education. The focus is on children's psychosocial protection and physical and psychosocial well-being. It includes the provision of mental health and psychosocial support, and most of the activity need to be play-based. As we move to the early recovery phase, there's an increased focus on structured learning, which can be formal or non-formal, depending on the type of emergency and policy environment. The learning environment becomes semi-permanent, or children are transitioned to permanent school facilities. And finally, in the long-term recovery and reconstruction, while we recognize the devastation that have been caused to the education system, this phase should also make use of the positive opportunities that may follow in the aftermath of an emergency. This is what we call building back better. This opportunity may involve the development of more inclusive education policy in relation to gender, disability, as well as language. And now I'd like to move to the second part. As we have seen, education needs and response are shaped by phases of emergency. And similarly, when we analyze the language in education in emergency and protracted crisis, we need to consider the emergency phases, as well as the displacement pattern. For example, temporary displacement versus significant internal displacement or refugee context. So if we apply this framework to multilingual education, the type and phases of emergency will present also different challenges and solutions for multilingual education in crisis context. During the acute phase, particularly for children affected by displacement, there will be a need for education providers to understand and recognize the importance of mother tongue and home languages for identity, well-being, and learning. Teachers need to focus first on building a strong rapport with their students, and this includes getting to know and appreciate their students' home languages and culture. Cell and playful learning will be hindered or enabled depending or not, on whether or not language challenges have been addressed. Social and emotional skills are generally organized into cognitive, social, and emotional domains and interact with individual attitude, belief, mindset, and values. So when we include cell intervention in education in emergencies, we need to consider social norm and the cultural environment children are exposed to and require appropriate contextualization. Cell is best delivered in children's mother tongue, in harmony with children's social and cultural norms. This is true in all contexts, but particularly in emergencies. In terms of like the recovery phase, as I said earlier, this is when we start to have more structured learning. So this is also the time when the integration of MLE approaches into the education emergencies program will be strengthened and deepened. And as well as in this phase, we expect communities to start to cope. It might become more feasible to engage communities and to promote two-way learning between displaced and host communities. This is also the phase where we can develop multilingual materials with hopefully collaboration of the community member. Our colleague Lagrita earlier was discussing some great example from indigenous communities. This is certainly applicable in emergency contexts. And also working closely with Ministry of Education. And this is also the time when displaced people can take on the role of teaching assistant. And finally, as we know, multilingual education takes time. So during the reconstructive phase, this is the phase when we can advocate and support more systematic long-term challenges while calling for flexibility when it comes to MLE in crisis setting. If curriculum were not inclusive enough and teaching practices and policies could be reviewed during this time to strengthen the integration of MLE. And sufficient time, effort for that advocacy, coordination, and collective action toward defined MLE goals need to be taking place at that period for the transformation and also to build the resilience of the education system. So within the multi-type of emergency, let's zoom in a bit on the case of displaced and refugee children and discuss some policy tension. So literature reviews and studies have highlighted this tension between, on one side, policy for medium of instruction and policy for refugee education. On one hand, research in the field of language in education policy and practice supports mother tongue-based multilingual education. And I mean, you are all very aware that schools should use home languages that students understand best in the early years of their schooling and continue to do so alongside structure and introduction of national and international languages. On the other hand, research and policy work in the field of education in emergencies highlight the benefit for refugee learners of being included in national school systems in the host countries. So including refugees in national schools in host countries can increase education access and retention and allow refugees to obtain formal certification of school completion. If segregated in refugee-only school and unable to return to their country of origin, refugees might be denied access to accredited education and face long-term discrimination. So while we want refugees to be included in host countries' education system, most of the time this happens when the systems are not really ready to receive them, and so refugees are submerged in unfamiliar languages of the host countries. And this brings negative outcome for learning and school persistence. So let's also look how this policy affect children? And obviously, there is this link between language well-being and identity. And so refugee children whose languages are not represented in school and who are not supported in bridging from the home language to the medium of instruction can face challenges for their identity development. And what you can see on the slide is a quote from Jean-Claude, a Congolese refugee in Uganda. He says, "You can't say they are your people if you don't speak their language." Jean-Claude questioned whether he shared an identity with those living in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Having experienced moderate loss of his home language and complete loss of French as a result of language instructional policies in Uganda that privilege English. Jean-Claude's example sheds a light on the experience of millions of children who pursue education in settings of conflict and whose learning, identity development, and source of well-being are influenced by the variety of languages they encounter in exile, including the language of instruction in school. So in addition to the trauma related to conflict and displacement, these children might experience language loss. This has obviously implications for their sense of belonging and also the development of negative self-image. Another key consideration is how language intersects with refugee children's learning pathway and aspiration for the future. And so long-term planning for education in protracted crisis and refugee context can be very challenging. And the projection needs to recognize and factor in multilingualism. In many protracted crises, we do not know whether the future of refugees and children will involve remaining in the host country, returning to the country of origin, entering a third country through continued migration and formal resettlement, ongoing transnationalism, or some combination of these trajectories. This is what Drayden Peterson from Harvard University labeled an unknowable future. But the learning pathways are also unpredictable. Because the first future is unknown, identifying and providing learning pathways to refugee children becomes particularly difficult and complex. With the integration into the host country, it is the recommended option. A lot of governments are not signatories to the UN Refugee Convention of 1951. And so the idea that the system needs to be built to allow for repatriation and reintegration in the country of origin education system. However, when children are back, this might be a distant future, but even when children are back, their education might not be recognized. And finally, because of this condition and setting, the languages that refugee and family might need for their education and future are also difficult to predict. It is challenging for family and teacher as well, and policymaker to define the linguistic trajectory the most appropriate. And I would like now to share an example from the Myanmar-Thailand case study that Save the Children has recently released a report to present the aspiration for the future of the current children who live in the refugee camp along the Myanmar-Thailand border. And the graph shows the result of focus group discussion, exploring the relevance of education services in the camp. It's interesting to see that student, parents, and teachers unanimously identified Thai and English languages as the top two things schools in the camp should do better to prepare students for their future. As well, the relevance placed on Burmese language was quite low in comparison, suggesting that students, parents, and teachers no longer consider returning to Myanmar as a viable option, and therefore do not consider the Burmese language as relevant to students' future aspirations. Other qualitative analyses in the report reveal that students in these camps placed a high value on learning their mother tongue, the Karen language. This indicates that refugee students have a strong commitment to their cultural identity. And so these findings suggest that children are conscious of the uncertainty of their education pathway. They're not sure which language may serve them best, and so they want to keep their option open to better their odds. And finally, in my third part, I would like to say that even if multilingualism adds a layer of complexity to the provision of quality and equitable education during emergency, we need to have this paradigm shift and promote it as a resource. We have to harness students and communities' linguistic resources. So I will not spend a lot of time on this slide as I think time is up, but as we have pointed out earlier, it's critical to honor the children's mother tongue, particularly where they've been facing the trauma of conflict and displacement. One thing that we recommend in this setting is to conduct a long language mapping to identify all the languages that are present in the refugee community, host community, and within the school. A planning grid is also a useful tool. We've touched a bit on the need to consider two-way learning. When a policymaker, practitioner, teacher are hosting refugees, they might not be aware of the constellation of refugees' languages, but this awareness can be raised in school quite easily, and there are a lot of examples on how to do that by inviting student community representative to bring their stories and their knowledge into the school and classroom. And refugee parents should also be invited to encourage children to maintain their home language and culture, even as they study other languages in school. And again, I want to stress how important it is to integrate social and emotional learning. It's a great way to support language learning when students are engaged in SEL activities. They develop communication skill, social awareness, self-regulation. They build relationship, all of which are vital skills for their language learning journey and integration in the host community. Teachers also play a vital role, and it is really recommended for teachers to spend time researching and learning about their student country of origin and their students' mother tongue. We also need to think that when there is mass displacement, a teacher's class may double in size with the arrival of many new students who don't speak the same language. And so students from refugee and displaced background can also arrive at a time throughout the school year, often without any prior planning or preparation by the school. So this can be very disturbing, and teachers might feel quite alone in this struggle. So it's important that teachers are trained and equipped with tools to adapt their practice, and MLE need to be included in education and emergencies teacher training. As well, we need to strengthen teacher peer support network so they can represent platform where teacher can have support for their well-being, as well as sharing ideas and best practice, and get that motivation to work collaboratively to integrate multilingualism into education. It's also an opportunity to get refugee population and displaced population as teacher assistant. Time is up, but I think I just wanted to stress how important it is to include pedagogical translanguaging as well in emergency education emergency program. And we know the evidence, and we've discussed the evidence about how important it is for as a key enabler for learning outcomes, and it is also quite cost efficient. And I'd like to finish just on this policy framework that has been developed by Harvard University, the REACH initiative, which promote really language as a resource approach into recognizing the differences. So the languages diversity of all students and host communities need to be leveraged by official school practices. Socially just language policy allow refugees to develop literacy in their home language in order to develop and hone their foundational learning skill, and also to ensure that they are still connected with their community and families, but integrate into host countries. And so this policy framework, whether the refugee students are integrated into the host country school system, or whether these refugees are in refugee camp until a potential repatriation, a language as a resource policy is definitely applicable in both cases. I want to remind you that on average, refugees stay in exile 10 to 70 years of their life. So we definitely need to include multilingual education in emergency and protracted crisis. And just to conclude, I would like to come back to what current refugees told us themselves. The uncertainty of what the future holds call for the mastery of different languages, mother tongue, national languages in home and host countries, as well as international languages. And to finish, I'd just like to say that without the systematic inclusion of multilingual education in emergencies, programs, and policy, we won't be able to tackle the global learning crisis and ensure no child is left behind. So thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to it.